In this video, I'm going to show you how we prepared our permaculture garden food forest for winter to be ready for the next planting season. By following a few simple techniques, we protect our soil, manage plant growth, and even improve our pathways so that they're both functional and enjoyable for the months that are coming. So let's dive into the winter preparation that makes a big difference come spring. One of the first things we work on is the garden beds themselves. We want to enrich and support the worms and microbiology that we find in the soil. So we take a unique approach to composting in the winter. Rather than relying solely on our hot compost pile, which is great when temperatures are warmer, we layer the beds with cut green grass and then laying it down quite thick throughout the garden beds. This layer acts as a natural compost and nitrogen source, breaking down slowly over winter and nourishing the soil in place. I've played around with vermicomposting, and the idea is that you have a layer of soil that they've created, the worms, and then you're layering food for them on top, and eventually the worms will come and digest the layer of food that you're placing on over top, and they'll slowly make their way up. And so we're doing this process, or mimicking this process, but on a larger scale within the garden beds themselves. I'm super careful to remove any seed heads from grasses or herbaceous plants like plantain that could be growing so they don't spread throughout the garden as it's getting established. Of course, we do have some plants that would be considered weeds growing around the garden, but we keep those in because they're edible. So things like dandelion and plantain, and eventually the garden or the food forest will find its balance between the different canopies found within the forest. On top of the grass layer that we include in the garden beds, we also add in some of the bedding from our rabbits. So this includes their droppings, some leftover bedding hay that is more green instead of the brown, harder hay that you can get for the layer of hay we're using. And then there's some hemp chips mixed in there as well. We then spread a light covering of yellow hay on top, and this provides insulation and helps maintain the moisture levels, and over time it's going to also break down and create a fibrous material that will improve water retention in the soil. So this combination of green grass and hay supports the microbiology, as I mentioned, in the soil, and attracts the worms that play such an important role in creating healthy, rich garden soil. So in the winter months, we'll throw our food scraps into the compost pile throughout those months, and when we get a hot compost going again, we will start composting that way. So the second step that we follow is prepping the pathways for the winter. So this could mean replacing the border. I think we're just gonna try this year without redoing the borders or taking out broken portions and just letting the paths kind of adjust naturally. Now that things are growing quite wildly, we're just kind of creating new pathways throughout the garden. So previously in our pathways, we've used wood chips to keep the weeds down, which worked a little bit. However, this year we decided we're going to try hay. We found that when we lay down a thick enough layer, it forms a dense matting that does a really good job of blocking out invasive vines like morning glory or other plants that tend to choke out our crops during the growing season. And you can see that in this picture here. Sean laid some hay down on our strawberry bed, and it has eliminated those plants. Plus, the hay pathway has another advantage. It's much softer and nicer to walk on barefoot compared to the rough wood chips. So not only are we keeping weeds at bay, but we're also creating a more comfortable garden environment while we are working in it. And then step 3, leaving plants as winter shelter for food and wildlife. Many people are eager to cut back plant material that has finished quote-unquote flowering like mint or lavender as soon as the blossoms have finished. However, I like to leave these parts of the plants until they become woody or a little bit more dry, and there's a couple of important reasons for this. First, by leaving these plants standing, we provide food sources for wildlife like bees and butterflies and other pollinators that might still be foraging later into the year. For example, I have calendula that is still blooming right now in the middle of November. So these provide other food sources when their food is really scarce. Second, leaving the plant stems like that allows them to dry out fully, which can prevent unwanted regrowth from the small green parts that might otherwise start sprouting from the base, especially in plants like mint or other plants that easily cultivate. In autumn, we're left with fully dried stems that are easier to manage and can be burned in the fire. Now let's talk about how I manage the plant material that we cut back. Instead of pulling up dead plants and weeds, we use a permaculture technique called chop and drop. This means that instead of throwing out plant cuttings, we leave them on the soil where they break down naturally, and that adds nutrients back into the soil and gives that food source the microbes and the worms are looking for as well. The tougher woody stalks I don't leave on the ground, like I said. Instead, we add this as extra material to our fires when we make biochar. If you're interested in learning more about how to make biochar, you can watch it in my other video. Now, even though the garden feels quieter and more restful in autumn, it's actually a surprisingly productive time. There's still plenty to harvest, and it's one of the joys of working with a food forest and garden. It keeps giving even when the days are shorter and cooler, and when you maybe don't have as much time to put into it as well. This season, I'm especially excited because I'm harvesting my first olives. Watching them grow over the months and finally getting to pick them now feels like a huge reward. So I looked into how to cure olives, and it's actually a 2 to 6 month process. So we'll see when we taste our first olives. But besides olives, there are plenty of herbs that are still going strong, even as the temperatures drop. Things like rosemary, thyme, and sage are hardy plants and thrive well into the cooler months. And this adds such a perfect touch to things like broths and soups that I'm making throughout the autumn and winter. Surprisingly, we're even harvesting zucchini in November. It's unusual. I find this really unusual, but also fantastic to have these summer vegetables in this late in the season. We have lots of kale as well, and even some leeks holding out for us. Some of the other things that I planted this year, like stinging nettle, are coming up again for the second time in more abundance. So I'm very excited to see how these little additions to the garden. I planted wild garlic last year. You can see as you watch through the video, I'm sure you can see some garlic plant popping up. So I'm interested to see if this wild garlic pops up in the springtime as well. We even have what I like to call volunteer plants, little potatoes or things that were left in the garden from the first harvest are starting to come up again, and often they'll make it through the winter and we'll be able to harvest them in spring without having done any extra work. So it's really quite amazing to have this abundance throughout these colder months as well. All these steps, from hay pathways to green grass and hay layering, creating biochar, work together to prepare the garden for a strong start in the spring. The materials that we add to the garden break down over time, and this adds organic matter to the soil, just like in a real forest. And the layers that we've built up help retain moisture even into the hotter months in summer. This summer we watered one time. We had more rain than usual, but we only had to water the garden one time during the summer this year. And this wildlife-friendly approach ensures that pollinators and other animals have space as well, which in turn benefits the garden, as these insects help to obviously pollinate the plants when they are most needed. All of these small winter tasks add up to a more resilient, productive garden without requiring as much additional input during the main growing season. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope this gives you some inspiration for your winter garden. Each garden is unique, so find what works best for you and don't be afraid to try something new each year. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe for more garden tips.